Okay, so what we've done so far is we've talked about the different disorders. We've talked about mood disorders, we've talked about anxiety-based disorders, we've talked about schizophrenia. Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, well, once we identify these disorders, especially once they're diagnosed, what therapy do we have? So how do we treat individuals, both in terms of treating their symptoms and the root cause? And so we're going to talk about therapy in a couple of different ways. So we'll walk through the different ways that we're going to think about it. Right. The first way that we're going to think about it is through kind of this bio and psychological approach. Okay, so there's a lot of information on the screen here, but let's kind of take it down one step at a time. So the first way that therapy occurs is through psychotherapy. Okay, so in fact, my wife is a psychotherapist. She's doing teletherapy right now from home. And so psychotherapy is an interactive experience with a trained professional working on understanding and changing behaviors, thinkings, relationships, and emotions. So this idea is a trained professional, someone that's developed a different skill set, is working with the client to help them understand how they want to change their behaviors, so changing maybe a bad habit, okay? Developing better relationships with others, so understanding where there's barriers in a relationship, very frequently focusing on that person's thinking, so why are they thinking in a negative way, why might they be catastrophizing, thinking the worst things possible are going to happen, and understanding their emotions, both why they're feeling a particular way, and then also how to manage their emotions. And so this is the kind of typical therapy kind of talk, we say is like a talk therapy, so kind of talking through the experiences you're having as a client, trying to understand those experiences. Now, the other piece to the current forms of therapy is a biomedical piece. So in this case, using medical procedures and medications directly acting on the body to reduce the symptoms of the disorder. So this is where it goes back to those neurotransmitters we talked about in day one, almost day one, and how we have imbalances of neurotransmitters in the brain that can cause these different psychological outcomes. And the biomedical therapy is going to address some of these issues. So it's going to help provide greater health stability, mental health stability, through adjusting neurotransmitters. In some very rare cases, there might be medical procedures that are done, but oftentimes these are more extreme cases where there's a greater threat to the person because of that disorder. And what we ultimately see, and the thing I really want to highlight here, is this combining of therapies. And so what we'll see when we talk about therapy, as maybe you may interact as a therapist, as you may become a therapist, is this idea of an eclectic approach. An eclectic approach uses techniques from various forms of therapy to fit the client's strengths, needs, and preferences. The idea here is that a good therapist will develop a large skill set, large toolbox, and they'll use different approaches that fit what works with the client and the issues that they're working with. So they won't just keep using the same technique over and over again, but rather they'll make adjustments. And we'll talk about this in terms of sometimes clients are resistant to therapy. Sometimes it's harder for them to cognitively process what's going on, but maybe they can process it more emotionally. Sometimes they need kind of more calming techniques. An eclectic approach uses this. And part of this eclectic approach is that medications and psychotherapy can be used together. And the idea here is that they may help each other in order of reducing the symptoms. So Katie oftentimes talks about kind of working with clients, and she's working on this eclectic approach. She's doing psychotherapy with the client, but also potentially waiting for the client to receive medication. In fact, she might write a report about what's going on in the therapy sessions, issues that are occurring, and share that with the doctor, so the doctor can then best assess what's going on and provide a medication that can be helpful. So you might see this in case of individuals, especially kids, having problems in the classroom with behavior issues. It might be a function of not only biomedical therapies, so medication that might help that child focus more, but also then psychotherapy. Okay, so what are some strategies that can be put in place to help the child manage their behaviors, to reward them for good behaviors, help parents understand what's going on. So again, good therapy is going to involve this eclectic approach. We're again seeing this biopsychosocial model come out in terms of the psychotherapy being that psychological piece and the biomedical therapy being that biological piece, addressing kind of multiple components together. And where we're going to head with this is talking about kind of different schools of thought of psychology, okay, in terms of especially psychotherapy. And this kind of just lays out for us the different forms of therapy that can be conducted and kind of where their value lies. So we'll talk about psychoanalysis and psychodynamic theory. So we're talking about Freud's legacy carried on to them. So where do we see Freud's influence in current therapy. Humanistic therapy goes back to Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. So when we talked about humanistic theory of personality development, what did that entail? What was the goal of processing and thinking about development from a humanistic perspective? So help me out with this answer. You can flip back if you need to. You can even do a Google search. We're talking about a humanistic perspective of psychological development. What are we talking about there? And we'll tie it then to client-centered therapy. So Nick has done a nice job, summarizing this. You guys can jump in and talk about other issues. The idea here is this humanistic therapy is focused on the client, being compassionate towards the client. It's also focused on this healthy promoting of how individuals achieve their goals, how they work towards that self-actualization, how they become a healthy individual. Okay, so we'll talk about how this humanistic perspective takes a role in the client-centered therapy. And client-centered therapy is really a focus, it's a foundation for any form of therapy right now. We talked about that already with the eclectic approach, where you're going to really focus on the client, do the things that they need to in order to be able to be helpful to them. We'll talk about behavior therapy in terms of Skinner and Pavlov, applying it to this operant and classical conditioning. And we'll especially spend some time on cognitive therapy, so how we change our thought processes in order to then reduce stress, reduce errors. We'll even tie it in also in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a frequently used form of therapy. We're not only going to change the cognitions, but also the goal is to change the behavior. All right, so let me just pause briefly here to see if you have any questions before we'll start breaking down each of these different types of psychotherapy. All right, so let's start from the beginning, where we start to see our first approach towards psychoanalysis. So the goal of psychoanalysis is to release the tension of repression and resolve unconscious inner conflict. The goal of psychoanalysis is to release the tension of repression and resolving unconscious inner conflict. So if we remember going back to Freud and his thinking about how personality develops, hence why we started this section talking about personality, is that Freud suggests that we have these inner conflicts. We have these conflicts that derive from our basic animal needs towards doing things that are socially appropriate. We have these conflicts of going through successfully different stages of development. So the anal stage, making sure that we're able to establish how we can take control over things, be able to handle that control. And so tying this kind of psychoanalysis thoughts together, Sigmund Freud believed that many people have anxiety related to the id-ego-super conflicts, superego, which conflicts with repression of sexual wishes. So the idea here is that part of his psychoanalysis is understanding the id, ego, and superego. So someone remind me what the id, ego, and superego are. Okay, so we're reviewing some of the material we haven't gotten a chance to talk about in a little bit. So what is the id, ego, and superego? It again, looking for just kind of the basic idea, basic definitions of id, ego, and superego, because this is where Freud really focuses on, and he focuses on this especially in terms of resolving issues related to the id, ego, superego in terms of sexual wishes. And you'll see how psychoanalysis and the techniques of psychoanalysis really relate to these concepts. So that's why I want to make sure we get a definition of them. If I can help with the question, or I just want to let me know you're catching up on things, just let me know. But that's the question at hand. What is the id, ego, and superego? you can go back to look at previous notes, Google it. Okay. So Sophia jumped in, gave a great response, very awesome, super appreciate it. The rational self is related to the ego. The id's based around these basic biological drives. And the superego is focused on societal rules and constraints. Okay, so great answer, very great answer. The idea here is that we have to balance these things out. Okay, so the ego is responsible for coming up with the rational self, kind of who you are, and it's balancing these basic inner drives, some of which are related to sexual repression, sexual wishes, and also balancing that out with the superego. It says, hey, here's the ideals, here's what society's rules has and their constraints. How do we deal with them? So great answer to allow us to kind of unpack what we think about. We think about psychoanalysis. So you kind of envision psychoanalysis as being based first on free association. So the patient here speaks freely about memories, dreams, and feelings. Okay, so they think about different things going on in their lives, they process past memories, and the idea here is that the patient speaks freely about whatever they'd like to. Okay, so we're going to see as we get through different forms of therapy, the therapist becomes more active. In this case, we see that the therapist is actually going to sit outside of the sight of vision of the patient. And the patient is going to be as comfortable as possible and kind of share and think about different emotions and work through them. And we'll talk about what happens during this free association, where the therapist starts to become involved. We also see the other big piece of psychoanalysis is interpretation. So the therapist suggests unconscious meanings and underlying wishes to help the client gain insight and release tension. So the idea here is that the therapist is going to look at some of the meanings behind the actions, especially kind of relating to dreams, so we'll talk about that here in a moment. We're going to try to understand, well, why does the client want something? Why does the client want certain good things to happen, bad things to happen? And help the client gain insight into why they're thinking this way. The idea is, if the client can gain insight into why they're having a stressor between the id and superego, that allows them to release this tension, allows them to start being more psychologically healthy. And so through this free association, especially through this interpretation, the therapist is going to be able to understand, well, where the individual is having difficulty. Now, one thing that's important to add at this point is that when we talk about psychoanalysis, especially free association involves repeated meetings almost once a day, for the whole week, for many, many months of just letting the patient kind of freely talk about their memory. We'll talk about how that ultimately isn't very efficient. But what the therapist is trying to do, and why it might take some time, is they're trying to find unconscious meaning in the client's resistance, dreams, and transfer. Unpack what each of these pieces are, because they're all critical towards understanding psychoanalysis and the process and why it's done with this free association. So a therapist is active in terms of psychoanalysis when they notice times when the patient seems blocked in speaking about a certain subject. So the therapist notices times when the patient seems blocked in speaking about a certain subject. So the experience might look something like this, or sound something like this. The client, the patient, is free associating. They're talking about different experiences throughout their life. And they get to talking about their father. And so the father comes up, and they quickly change the topic. And maybe the therapist takes note of this. Then, as we're talking about family gatherings, the therapist notices that the father's not spoken about. So the therapist might ask, was your father there? The client says yes. And the therapist might ask, well, why are you not talking about your father? And in noticing this resistance, that the client is not talking about their father, you might say, well, maybe there's an issue with that father. There's that conflict that needs to get resolved. And so the therapist might direct the client towards talking more about their father, again, through that free association, and try to take note of what's going on. See if the client starts to bring out characteristics that are problematic in the relationship with their father. Freud very much believed in dreams, and believing that as you're processing information in your mind at night, that there's kind of content that starts to come out. Basically, this repressed ideas and wishes, because you're not monitoring them, starts to come out in your dreams. So there's maybe some latent content behind the plot of a patient's dream. And you can think about this. This is kind of something you can even go on websites and type in, falling and what that indicates and the latent content behind it. Sometimes there's interpretations of that. Sometimes there's just simple interpretations of kind of thinking about dreams. So I had a dream a previous night ago where I was trying to work on something and the rules kept kind of changing. I wasn't kind of really sure how to do it. And I woke up in the morning kind of thinking about, well, that really captures what's going on now. Okay, so as we're quarantined, we're trying to do the best we can as instructors, as a university, to adjust and do the things students need and get adjusted to new restrictions that we have. And so that was just kind of coming out in my dream. I'll tell you my favorite dream is actually one that I had where I was stressed out because I was supposed to take an exam. So it's kind of a classic school stress-related dream. It's, again, during a time I was really stressed as I was actually finishing finals as an instructor. And I remember what was really funny about it is not only was I stressed about taking the exam, the problem was that I had written the exam, so I was stressed because I didn't know how to study for an exam that I wrote, because if you write the exam, it would make sense that you don't really need to study for it because you know the information. And so I remember just kind of being this weird thing. And I remember waking up that morning and be like, that is a really funny way to just say that I'm stressed about exams and helping students through them. So someone doing psychoanalysis may pick up on these dreams and kind of running themes that go on through these dreams, or interpret certain experiences within the dreams having some kind of meaning. The last piece is transference. An idea here is that patients may have reactants towards the therapist that are actually based on feelings towards someone from the past. So the patient may have reactants towards the therapist that are actually based on feelings towards someone from the past. And this is actually something that is still really used in therapy quite a bit. The idea being here is that the patient starts talking to the therapist as if the therapist was that particular person they're trying to address the relationship with. So going back to our father example, the client might start talking to the therapist as if the therapist is their father. They might share how they feel towards their father. They might express anger towards the therapist because they can't express it towards their father. Katie does a little bit of this to some extent with her kids. So in some cases, her kids that she does therapy with have lost loved ones. And so she says, well, if you could write a letter to your loved one, what would that look like? And she kind of has the children write the letter to their loved one, and she kind of works with them and kind of responds as if she was that lost, that family member that the client lost, the family member that passed away in the child's life. And so it's not a direct transference, but for kids that would be kind of that idea. Okay, you might have experienced transfers yourself. You start finding yourself kind of yelling at a roommate, at a family member, realizing that you're not really upset with them, you're kind of transferring feelings that you have towards others, towards that particular person. Okay, so again, transference is one concept that we still work with in therapy, but resistance and dreams are a little bit less so. Now, I will say it's disappointing we're not in the classroom. Actually, what I love to do is that I let you guys partner up with each other, and you actually do little mini therapy sessions using these different techniques. So what I would have asked you to do is do psychoanalysis with a partner. Again, not necessarily something evaluating really in-depth issues, but a chance to kind of process things. Unfortunately, I don't think that'll work well for us in this format, but you can kind of imagine as we're going through each of these different types of therapy, what the different techniques would look like, what it would be like to be a client, but also what it would look like to be the therapist in these different techniques. So we talked a lot about Freud and his psychoanalysis approach. Let me pause here to see if we have any questions. If you're good, let me know through chat before we start talking about humanistic therapy, which does become kind of the foundation, the backbone of more modern therapy. Okay, so I'll pause here for you guys to give me more input. Some responses that were good. I'm glad to hear that. Glad to hear things are going well. A lot of content for us to process, a lot of things to work through today, but hopefully you find it interesting and a good, strong way to finish class. So let's go ahead and get in then to our humanistic therapy. So again, Maslow and Rogers, as part of humanists, emphasize the human potential for growth, self-actualization, and personal fulfillment. Remember, Freud was really trying to understand these unconscious drives, these things that were hard to understand and process that really weren't visible. Humanistic psychology focused more on saying, well, hey, let's think about how we can make people feel positive, how we help them reach their growth potential, work towards that self-actualization of being open and honest with themselves, being able to understand others, and that personal fulfillment of being most successful. So if you're working with a therapist who has this humanistic perspective, they'd help you understand how you could grow as a student, how you can get past the limitations, the stressors that you're experiencing, so you can fulfill all these goals that you have. And specifically as we process this, Humanistic therapy attempts to support personal growth by helping people gain self-awareness and self-acceptance. And so part of that self-awareness is similar to Freud. Freud wanted self-awareness in terms of helping patients understand how they're feeling about certain things, how they're feeling about issues. But in this case, that self-awareness is not so much in terms of these unconscious drives, more so in kind of thinking back and reflecting on the way that you're thinking back on your behavior. So they might point out that, as you start to get ready for exams, that, you start to stress yourself out, don't approach it with some calmness, maybe you're waiting till the last minute. So that gets you more self-aware of the things that you're doing. Relatedly, it gets you into self-acceptance. Okay, so understanding who you are, that it's okay to have these limitations, it's okay to struggle, to be able to accept the person as you are, as you currently stand. And again, both of these promote this growth. And ultimately what it comes back to is this client-centered therapy approach. So it's another name for this style of humanistic therapy. We're focused on meeting the client where they're at, helping that client grow through different strategies, whether it be changing their cognitions, changing their behaviors, helping them process things in a different way. Again, the idea here is that the therapist in this case is much more active in terms of helping that person become self-aware and self-accepting, kind of challenging their rationales, challenging the client's beliefs in order to help them understand where they're thinking about things potentially in a negative way. And so what I want to do is talk about humanistic therapy and the things that it promotes. And you'll see that several of the things that it promotes are consistent with what we talked about in terms of developing in a healthy way based on this humanistic perspective. Okay, so again, psychotherapy in terms of this humanistic perspective involves promoting growth. Okay, so how do you get that person to take on new challenges? How do you get them to become more comfortable with themselves? How do you get them to reach that pinnacle of kind of who they are? And to do that, what they encourage the client to do is take responsibility for feelings, actions, and accepting oneself. So to be active in terms of that person thinking about their feelings and why they're feeling that way. To take responsibility for their actions, so why they hurt someone else, why they're not connecting with a close family or a loved one, why they might be self-sabotaging, inflicting harm on themselves, maybe from this self-handicap when they're harming themselves so that they don't have to take responsibility if they don't do well. And that all fits with this idea of accepting oneself, understanding your limitations, the things that you're good at and things that you're not good at. Now, the role of the therapist in humanistic psychotherapy to help promote that growth, to help the individual take on responsibilities, is to provide an environment where that growth can occur. And that environment looks like one where the therapist is very accepting of the other person. They're not judgmental towards the other person as they talk about, the conflicts that they might be experiencing. So, a client might say that they're anxious about going outside, and the therapist might think, well, that's ridiculous, just go outside. But instead of saying something like that, they're going to meet the person where they're at, and they're kind of process, well, why is that person afraid of going outside? Okay, so addressing their agoraphobia. And so they're going to help the therapist is going to help provide a nurturing environment where the person can start accepting themselves, understand that, where they might be struggling. And as part of this, the content of the therapy starts to become very different. So whereas with psychoanalysis, the content of the therapy is these unconscious drives, trying to kind of get deep down into things that the client might not be aware of. Instead, the content of therapy for humanistic psychotherapy is involved in how the person feels in that moment, how they can express their emotions, the things that they're aware of, those things that are in their conscience, and really focusing on this actual and ideal self. So I'm at this point with how I feel about, the job that I have, dealing with the stressors at my job, but I want to be happy about my job. I want to be able to navigate these stressors. So how do I make that leap from this kind of actual self of where I am to this ideal self? What's holding me back? What are some of the cognitions that maybe are problematic? How do I make myself kind of feel more calm and relaxed? And what also changes too, that's important to note, is the time focus. So the time focus here is focused more on the present and future. So Freud was very focused on the past, especially focused on childhood and going through the psychosexual stages, understanding relationships between parent figures and child. In this case, the time focus is very much more focused on what's going on now and how can we make changes, improve on things as we go forward. So this becomes a distinct characteristic about humanistic psychotherapy, is helping the person grow by thinking about what's going on now, how do they address those conflicts so they can become more successful in the future. And again, this is the more of this client-centered therapy that we'll traditionally see now in terms of doing therapy. Okay, so if you take any kind of counseling classes, get into anything interested in social work, nursing as well, I would believe, this type of humanistic psychotherapy becomes a bedrock of those courses and the development of knowledge there. Okay, so with that being said, since it's so central, let me pause at this point to see if you have questions. Again, if you guys are good, let me know over chat that you're set and good to go. Before we start getting into behavioral therapy, which we'll see still has this humanistic perspective to it. So let me know if you're all good. Let me know if you have questions, things I can go back to. Seems like we're doing well, so let's go ahead and continue talking about behavioral therapy. Now, one of the key things, and maybe you've been thinking about this, is that sometimes insight into problems really isn't necessarily helpful. I may understand that it's difficult for me to go outside, and that presents a stressor, and that it's not beneficial. It's causing me to be limited in the things I can do. I may be very aware of what this is. But that insight, that understanding, isn't necessarily helpful for me to resolve this mental health problem. It's not helpful in allowing me to be able to take on that challenge of getting outside, interacting with others. And so sometimes we have to kind of take a step back and realize that just the insight, just the knowledge, isn't necessarily going to help someone recover. And so where we start to see behavioral therapy coming in is it uses these behaviors of learning, especially classical and operant conditioning, to help us reduce these unwanted responses. These might include behaviors such as addictions or emotions, things such as panic. The idea here is that these therapies are focused on behaviors that that person doesn't want to display, that may be keeping the client from being successful. Okay, so you're not going to be able to reach your potential if you're not able to get outside and interact with others. You're not going to be able to reach your potential in class if your behavior keeps self-sabotaging yourself, keeping you from being able to do well in the exams because you're self-handicapped, putting limitations in front of yourself in order to be successful. Behavior therapy will help you get more focused on the tasks that you're doing. Allows you to kind of address distractors, things along those lines. Maybe this is something we all could benefit from in terms of behavioral therapy. All of these are designed, this behavioral therapies, to get you towards being able to be successful. And so these behavioral therapies are especially related to addictions, related to panic, so understanding that behavior of having a panic attack, being panicked by different things, and how to address those behaviors.